Hello and most welcome to 1141 of the Heidegger series. We are today early on in the lovely gardens of Trädgårdsföreningen in the middle of Gothenburg. And I was here with a gardener 2-3 days ago. Friday it was, today is Tuesday. And she said that the whole place has been even better now than 5 years ago. It's become more solemn, a bit more Asian and dramatic. So she thought it was a very nice change. What a good place to speak about space. This is from Stephen M Rosen's Dimensions of Apeiron. I read an excerpt earlier on, but this is the real McCoy. And it goes into the change of thinking, so to speak, with the foundations as time, space, and causality. I go directly to the first chapter. The rise and fall of classical space, continuity and individuation. Classical philosophy and the science that grew out of it are rooted in the drive toward individuation. To this end, the prime directive of the classical enterprise is to wrest order from chaos of nature. As we saw in the preface, pre-Socratic philosophy viewed nature in the raw as apeiron, the Greek word meaning limitless, boundless, indeterminate. Apeiron is the unintelligible, the many, the moving, the ugly, the bad, the inchoate flux of opposites or contraries, the principle of disorder or disharmony. In the proto-scientific practices of alchemy, primordial nature is called prime matter, prima materia, which is the original chaos and the sea. The sea. The aim of the early science and philosophy was to tame and transform Mother Nature. The emergent individual must extricate himself from her turbulent waters. Out of the chaotic womb of nature, one must forge a singular identity. From the many of apeiron must come one. A detached posture must therefore be assumed so as to stabilize and fix one's position in the world. In this way, one makes a place for oneself in a world that, for its part, is now transformed. The boundless activity of wild nature is subdued. From irrational apeiron comes peras, action that is rationalized, subjected to ratio, measurement, action that therefore is limited, held within boundaries, contained within a changeless framework, by thus stabilizing his point in relation to a stabilized world. Man, the detached subject, can exert his influence over nature. He can treat it as an object, parcel it out, measure it with even greater precision. For as Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. homo mensura. Classical thought comes into its own in the writings of Plato. In the Timaeus, Plato states that we must make a threefold distinction and think of that which becomes, that in which it becomes, and the model which it resembles. The first term refers to any particular object that is discernible through the senses. The model for the transitory object is the eternal object, the changeless form or archetype. This perfect form is eidos, a rational idea or ordering principle in the mind of the demiurge. Using his archetypical thoughts as his blueprints, the divine creator fashions an orderly world of particular objects and events. As for that in which an object becomes, Plato speaks of the receptacle, describing the latter as invisible and formless, all-embracing. It is the vessel used by the demiurge to contain the changing forms without itself changing. Plato goes on to characterize the receptacle as space. In parenthesis, it's necessary to understand that both of these are created simultaneously, both are equally important, and the third is to neglect one is to neglect both. And the latter one often happens within postmodernism and modernism. Sorry about the parenthesis. Where does the apeiron enter Plato's account? When the demiurge transposes his divine thinking into earthly patterns, the copies he creates of his perfect ideas are themselves imperfect. That is because the transposition process requires the demiurge to work through the prima materia, the primitive chaos of irrational becoming. Plato puts it as follows. The were, before the world came into existence, being, space, and becoming, three distinct realities. The nurse of becoming was characterized by qualities of water and fire, of earth and fire. But as there was no homogeneity or balance in the forces that filled, no part of it was in equilibrium, but swayed unevenly under the impact of the motion. Before the four basic constituents were arranged in an ordered universe, they were all without proportion or measure. Fire, water, earth, and air bore some traces of the proper nature, but were in their disorganized state to be expected of anything which God has not touched. And his first step, when he set about reducing them to order, was to give them a definite pattern of shape and number. We must thus assume as all principle in all we say that God brought them to a state of the greatest possible perfection, in which they were not before. End of quote. Of course, the greatest possible perfection is not the same as total perfection. What this means is that the demiurge did not quite succeed in taming wild nature, as Plato readily admitted. Stated in terms of space, the receptacle in which nature was to be subdued actually did not perform its function with complete efficiency. Instead of containing the forces of chaos in a manner that kept them fully in check, the container was subject to their disruptive influences. And this was true even after the formative hand of God was felt. The philosopher of science, John C. Graves, in his description of the inhomogeneity of Platonic space, notes accordingly that the irrational motion, the fleeting potencies, and constantly changing tensions persist even after the action of the demiurge, and thus constantly tend to undo his work. End of quote. Therefore, while the receptacle was supposed to contain change without itself changing, we can see that this was not entirely the case. With the still potent forces of wild nature forever threatening to break free, and indeed periodically succeeding at this, the receptacle was in fact rather given to porosity. At any time, it could spring a leak. In other words, the inhomogeneity of Platonic space made it susceptible to being ruptured, to losing its continuity. However, for his part, Graves argues for the complete continuity of the receptacle. He claims that it can have no holes or discontinuities, since this would mean either that it is possible for bodies to move in these holes and thus no longer be in space, or else the holes would be forbidden to bodies, and there is no reason why any such region should exist. End of quote. A little later, Graves says the following about the original condition of chaos. In such a state of random, chaotic activity, it's hard to see how regions could be distinguished in such a way as to make a notion of discontinuity meaningful. End of quote. These conclusions seem to indicate that Graves has fallen prey to the elusive subtlety of the continuity idea. Evidently, Graves views a hole in the continuum as a well-differentiated region that one could enter or leave. Or perhaps a region that one is forbidden from entering. In making this assumption, he appears unwittingly to impose the idea of continuity upon the discontinuity he alludes to. By no means could the absence of continuity be circumscribed within a well-bounded region of space that one could enter or leave, since such boundedness or differentiability itself presupposes continuity. As will become clearer in the more detailed study of continuity to follow below. Discontinuity does not require the regions of space to be distinguishable. Could I ask for some coffee because my throat is killing me?
I can hardly talk.
Here. Yes. Sorry, I slept with an open window tonight. I think you can hear that. Hopefully it will clear out. By no means could the absence of continuity be circumscribed within a well-bounded region of space that one could enter or leave, since such boundedness or differentiability itself presupposes continuity. Discontinuity does not require that regions of space be distinguishable, as Grace appears to think. On the contrary, precisely that they not be. Therefore, the original condition of chaos is one in which it is continuity that is lacking, not discontinuity. And the fact that, despite all efforts of the demiurge, apeiron is still in evidence in Platonic space, attests to the lingering absence of continuity here. The Platonic continuum is but a proto-continuum. Nevertheless, Plato's receptacle, leaky though it was, represented a significant advance in the classical program of containing apeiron. And this nascent idea of spatial continuity was brought to fruition with the rebirth and refinement of classical thought at the time of the Renaissance and in its aftermath. The continuum, in its more mature form, was no longer seen to be buffeted by irrational forces of prime nature. The guiding influence in ridding space of chaotic matter, thus stabilizing it, was the work of René Descartes. Unlike the Platonic receptacle, Descartes' space is perfectly homogeneous. This also from Graves. Only now, with all the holes in Plato's leaky vessel, seemingly plugged, does space appear to be completely continuous. To be sure, when Descartes proposed his new way of thinking about space, he was not speaking about the evolution of space itself, but only of our understanding of it. Descartes offered an intuitive clarification of what he believed to be given to us a priori, a self-evident universal truth that is to be taken as granted in advance, thus not susceptible to modification. For Descartes, space always, already is completely continuous. Though Plato may have lacked the insight to appreciate this, Descartes related this continuum to the idea of extension. Consider as an illustration the simplified space represented by a line segment. In the Cartesian approach, it is intuitively self-evident that the line, however short, has extension. It must then be continuous. It can possess no holes or gaps in it, since if the point elements composing it were not densely packed, we would not have a line at all, but only a collection of extensionless points. The quality of being extended implies the infinity or density of the constituent point elements. Yet, at the same time, intuitive reflection discloses the paradox that the absence of gaps in the continuum not only holds this classical space together, but also permits it to be indefinitely divided. Think about Xenon. Without a gap in the line to interrupt the process, there is no obstacle to endless partitioning of it into smaller and smaller segments. As a consequence, though, the points constituting this continuum indeed are densely packed. They are distinctly set apart from one another. However closely positioned any 2 points may be, a differentiating boundary permitting further division of the line always exists. In parenthesis, from this we see that a hole in the continuum, rather than constituting a well-differentiated region of space, would actually entail a breakdown in spatial differentiability.
Your voice sounds that it needs sun, so let's go.
I'll bring the thermos. Where should I stand here?
Last time I was here, I think, and you and I placed the microphone here. Oh, what did I do?
The microphone you can put on the ground, because it's actually very good at taking up the sound, as long as it's directed to where the voice comes from.
Joo.
Yet at the same time, intuitive reflection discloses that paradox, that the absence of gap in the continuum not only holds this classical space together, but also permits it to be indefinitely divided. Indefinitely divided. Without a gap in the line to smaller and smaller, without a gap in the line to interrupt the process, there is no obstacle to the endless partitioning of it into smaller and smaller segments. As a consequence, though the points constituting this continuum indeed are densely packed, they are distinctly set apart from one another. And in parenthesis, this is the very core of reductionism. Without this foundation of space, reductionism wouldn't be a thing. However closely positioned any 2 points may be, a differentiating boundary permitting further division of the line always exists. From this we see that a hole in the continuum, rather than constituting a differentiated region of space, would actually entail a breakdown in spatial differentiability. End of parenthesis. As Milic Čapek puts it in his critique of the classical notion of space, no matter how minute a spatial interval may be, it must always be an interval separating 2 points, each of which is external to the other. End of quote. The infinite divisibility of the extensive continuum also implies that its constituent elements themselves are unextended. Consequently, the point elements of the line can have no internal properties, no structure of their own. An element can have no boundary that would separate an interior region of it from what would lie on the outside. All must be on the outside, as it were. In other words, the Cartesian line consists not of internally substantial, concretely bounded entities, but only of abstract boundedness as such. Sheer externality alone holds sway, what Heidegger calls the outside of one another, of multiplicity of points. Moreover, whereas the point elements of classical space are utterly unextended when space is taken as a whole, when space is taken as a whole, its extension is unlimited, infinite. Although I have used a finite line segment for illustrative purposes. The line considered as a dimension into itself actually would not be bounded in this way. Instead of its extension being terminated after reaching some arbitrary point. In principle, the line would continue indefinitely. This means that the sheer boundedness of the line is evidenced not only locally in respect to the infinitude of boundaries present within its smallest segment. We see it also in the line as a whole, inasmuch as its infinite boundedness would be indefinitely extended. Of course, this understanding of space is not limited to the line. Classically conceived, a space of any dimension is an infinitely bounded, infinitely extended continuum. Naturally, it would be a category mistake to interpret the infinitude of classical space as characteristic of what is object. Space is not an object, but is the receptacle of the objects, the changeless context within which objects are manifested. This distinction, initially made by Plato, is reflected in the thinking of Kant, who held that perception of particular objects and events are contingent, always given to variations, but that perceptual awareness is organized in terms of an immutable intuition of space. In the words of Fuller and Sterling McMurrin, Kant took the position that no matter what our sense experience was like, it would necessarily be smeared over space and drawn out in time. Implied here is the categorical separation of what we observe, the circumscribed objects, from the medium through which we make our observation. We observe objects by means of space. We do not observe space. It is within the infinite boundedness of space that particular boundaries are formed. Boundaries that enclose what is concrete and substantial. The concreteness of what appears within boundaries is the particularity of the object. In short, an object most essentially is that which is bounded. where a space is the contextual boundedness that enables the finite object to appear. We ignore it. We continue. We can also talk, as I mentioned 1 week ago, space bounding using the gerund. Like it's a sort of action performed by space. Whereas the object is bounded. Avslutat, finished. The spatial context is what mediates between object and subject. The latter personified by the demiurge in the Timaeus is the third term of the classical account and corresponds to what is unbounded. That an object possesses boundaries speaks to Descartes' characterization of it as res extensa, an extended thing. What has extension will be bounded. In contrast, the subject is res cogitans, a thinking thing, entirely without extension in space. The subject has no boundaries or parts. As a consequence, it is indivisible. This is etymologically equivalent to stating that the subject is an individual. We may say of the Cartesian individual what we said of Cartesian space, that it is more mature, more fully developed than its Platonic counterpart. To better appreciate Plato's idea of the subject or the self, let us consider a still earlier sense of personal identity. In the mythic epoch that prevailed before the rise of classical Greece, the individual was distinctly lacking in autonomy. According to the culture philosopher Jean Gebser, mythic experience was not so much actively orchestrated by the directed volition of the conscious individual as it was passively undergone, as in a dream. Gebser thus portrayed dream-like mythical consciousness as egoless, we-oriented. The weakness of mythic individuality was reflected in the weakness of the divinities that were projected by the men and women of the time. By no means did the diffuse pantheon of gods that reign in these times constitute an omnipotent agency. For above the god is fate, a blind, inscrutable will to which even Zeus must yield. The fate that ruled the gods was depicted as mysterious goddess, or three such womanly figures, the Fates. Their blindness and inscrutability speak to irrational character. According to Francis Cornford, this early notion of faith or necessity is just the opposite of what it has come to mean to us today. mythic necessity is not that which is fixed, permanent, unalterable, knowable beforehand, but it is the indeterminate, the inconsistent, the anomalous, that which can be neither understood nor predicted. In other words, the fate that governed the mythic gods was apparent. Thus, the mythic individual was in effect 2 steps removed from full-fledged autonomy. She was ruled by the gods, who were in turn ruled by the fickle finger of fate, by the goddess Apeiron, known also as Mother Nature. From this we can see why Gebser would conclude that mythic consciousness was essentially spaceless. In myth, the chaotic potencies of Apeiron went largely uncontained. The rise of classical Greece constituted a refinement and sublimation of mythic experience. The influence of the old deities began to recede, and an enhanced sense of personal identity and agency gradually came to the fore. This heightening of human individuality was manifested in the growth of critical thinking and reflective intellectuality, particularly among these members of society with sufficient leisure time to engage in such activities. A philosopher class emerged, and with it an increased attitude of skepticism toward the ancient gods. Among sophists like Protagoras, for example, then with Plato the process of transforming mythic identity reached its culmination. Evidenced in the writings of Plato is a curious mixture of incisive critical thinking and a religious faith that might appear to hark back to the age of the myths. Indeed, Plato presupposes the form of identity that constituted the very core of mythical consciousness, the soul. The essential characteristics of the mythical structure, says Gebser, is the awareness of the soul. For Plato, a human being in its essence is not a mortal ego grounded in the material body, but a spiritual presence centered in the soul. And yet, Plato's treatment of the soul was hardly a regression to original mythic experience. As is abundantly clear from the works such as Phaedo and the Republic, Plato sought to imbue the soul with reason. mythic identity, ruled as it was by apeiron, was largely irrational. In Platonic transformation of the soul, apeiron was now to be contained. I noted above that in Timaeus, the containment of apeiron was the function of the demiurge. This was the deity who projectively personified the new rational self. The god of Plato was in fact a far more potent figure than had been Zeus, and his companions in the pantheon. In the demiurge, the diffuse powers of the old mythic gods had become concentrated in the power of a singular being, an active agent who, in gaining greater control over apeiron, in containing the tempestuous goddess in his receptacle, was now capable of bringing order to all of creation. Of course, the demiurge had not gained complete control over apeiron. We have seen that the irrational potencies of apeiron were forever threatening to spill over and spill out of the spatial vessel, so that an ongoing effort was required of the deity to keep them contained. Yet, he did manage to contain them much of the time. What I'm proposing here is that the Platonic demiurge, far from being a reversion to the pre-rational divinity projected by the mythic self, was the prototype of a new and more individuated self. Following Plato's time, this nascent identity would be projected as the even more individuated monotheistic God of Judeo-Christianity, and after incubating in that the guise for over a millennium, it would begin to come into its own at the time of the Renaissance, when the projection of the Judean Christian Deus ex machina began to be withdrawn. With the rise of Judeo-Christian monotheism, a whole new experience of divinity came to prominence. The Hebraic Yahweh was both more powerful God than was the demiurge, and a more personal one. For Yahweh, there is no ongoing struggle to contain apeiron, since, in effect, it is he who creates chaotic apeiron to begin with, then quickly subdues her. We see this in the opening passages of the Old Testament. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from darkness. It follows from this that the Judaic cosmos is more homogeneous than was Platonic protospace. The formless energies of dark nature are created ex nihilo by a rational God, who moves at once to contain them and has little difficulty in doing so. Let there be light, says he. And no sooner was this said than it was done. Concomitant to the Judaic enhancement of divine power was its internalization. There was now a personal covenant with God through which the capacities of human individual were themselves expanded. Very important, expanded. By faithfully upholding the sacred part, by following God's commandments from day to day and moment to moment, the individual was better able to order his or her life, to gain a greater measure of control over it. Thus, the new, intensified, more intimate relationship with divinity marked a further crystallization of human individuality, with less projection of effective agency to an external source. Judaic individuation was brought to a culmination with the emergence of Christianity. For with the coming of Messiah, there was not merely a close personal relationship with the divine. Rather, God had come down to earth, had become incarnated in the form of human being. As Richard Tarnas puts it, in Christ, the historical and the timeless, the absolute and the personal, the human and the divine became one. Nevertheless, despite the symbolic union of humanity and God through the mediation of Jesus, the distinction surely had not simply been abolished. Yes, Christ was somehow both divine and mortal. He had appeared on earth, gone to the cross, was resurrected, then reunited with his Father in heaven. The promise was that Christ would come again to redeem humanity, to lead it into the kingdom of heaven. But in the meanwhile, a great chasm still existed between the power and the glory of the Creator on the one hand, and the earth-born mortals he had created. On the other hand, it was true that by surrendering himself to Jesus, a human could align himself with God. So close could a person of faith draw to God, yet so far away God remained. The disintegration of classical civilization was completed around 500 CE. In the millennium that followed, the Church reigned supreme. During the Middle Ages, there was little overt evidence that individuation was being further advanced. Then, as this period of gestation, a whole new order of identity began to emerge. by no means was the Renaissance merely a rebirth of the post-mythic individual of classical Greece. Indicated now was the appearance of a new post-Christian individual. 2000 years after the old mythic sense of identity was transformed by the Greeks, Judeo-Christian individuality started undergoing its own transformation. According to Gebser, with the Renaissance, man is henceforth not just in the world, but begins to possess it. No longer possessed by heaven, he becomes a conscious possessor, if not of the heavens, at least of the earth. Gebser dramatizes this transformative secularization and its inseparability from a new awareness of space. By citing a 1336 letter of Francesco Petrarch, the discoverer of landscape, Petrarch describes his ascent of Mont Ventoux, an experience that unsettles him and produces intense agitation. I was immediately awestruck and shaken by unaccustomed wind and the wide, freely shifting vistas. Petrarch's letter is written as a confession of an epiphany that transforms his entire life. He goes on to say, "What I experience today will surely benefit myself as well as many others." Gebser comments that the experience in question was nothing less than an encounter with what was then a new reality. I think you can leave it, Kalle. I think you can leave it.
No, I propose that we move there to the sun over there.
Gebser comments that the experience in question was nothing less than an encounter with what was then a new reality. The event that Petrarch describes in almost prophetic terms as certainly of benefit to himself and many others inaugurates a new realistic, individualistic and rational understanding of nature. The trip to the summit of Mont Ventoux and subsequent inspection of the vast panorama that lay below is portrayed by Gebser as the first movement into a free, open and unenclosed space, an elemental eruption of the third dimension and transformation of Euclidean plane surfaces." End of quote. The new space to which Gebser allude far surpasses the leaky vessel of the proto-Christian demiurge and even the better insulated Judean Christian cosmos. Within the Renaissance, the continuum now manifests itself as thoroughly sealed, entirely homogeneous, with a parent nowhere to be found. Evidently, it is no longer the case that order must be brought to space by the divine act of subduing a parent. Instead, space is considered to be well ordered from the first, its continuity being taken a priori. Whereas Renaissance space is constituted by sheer extensiveness, and the objects extended therein are fully constrained by its laws, the laws of motion. The Renaissance subject is utterly unextended, thus freely transcendent of space. This speaks to the self-possessed autonomy of the new individual. More decisively than ever before, the individual is his own man. In freeing himself from heaven, from the erstwhile constraints of God and religion, he does not simply return to the earth. On the contrary, he stands apart from that as well. For as Gebser suggests, the Renaissance man possesses the earth, which means that instead of merely becoming immersed in worldly matters, he turns them into his objects so he can shape them to his will. In freeing, thus, in standing apart from God, the newly secularized subject himself becomes godlike. He possesses without being possessed, and what he possesses, what he shapes and molds to his desires, recreates in his own image, are the objects cast before him in space. The word object comes from Latin objicere, to cast before. End of quote. The Renaissance subject, or I, can be said to be a function as an eye, E-Y-E. It is a point of view, a window or perspective upon the objects. Accordingly, Gebser designates the new world of the Renaissance as the perspectival world. The development of the technique of perspective in art indeed was a defining innovation of the Renaissance, and Gebser goes to pains to describe its historical unfoldment during the 14th to 16th centuries. In the course of this account, Gebser notes perspectival man's predominantly visual or sight orientation, and points out quote, the basis of the perspectival worldview is the visual pyramid. The two lines extend from the eyes and meet the object viewed. The image form includes the subject, the object, and the space in between. Piero della Francesca clearly expresses this in his remark. The first is the eye that sees, the second the object seen. The third, the distance between the one and the other. End of quote. The Renaissance differentiation of the subject, the object, and the space in between clearly parallels the Platonic threefold distinction of that which becomes, that in which it becomes, and the model which it resembles. Both formulations reflect the crux of classical cognition, the axiomatic base serving as its unquestioned point of departure, the self-evident intuition of object in space before subject. The object is what is experienced. The subject is the transcendent perspective from which the experience is had, and the space is the continuous medium through which experience occurs. The relationship among these three terms is that of categorical separation. Of course, the Platonic version of this trichotomy is less well developed than in its Renaissance successor. Again, Plato's model is eidos, a formative idea in the mind of the demiurge, who is the divine subject seeking to impose order upon matter. Because the subject is still struggling with disorder, with the peiron, it is less effective an agent than the transcendent subject of the Renaissance. The Platonic subject is less able to stand apart, to gain a detached perspective upon nature. It therefore cannot fully contain the irrational potencies of nature, so that in which nature becomes, Plato's receptacle or space is a leaky vessel. Spatial continuity will be realized, step taken toward individuation. It is for the Renaissance subject that nature appears fully contained, securely enclosed within the uniform space context. The latter was Heidegger's term for the Galilean framework in which all bodies could be precisely located, probed, experimented upon, submitted to mathematical analysis, and ultimately shaped and manipulated through the enterprises of science and technology. The crystallization and consideration of space thus brought enhanced objectivity and unprecedented capacity for one to focus clearly and sharply on what lay before them. The objects of nature were now laid open, fully exposed, extended for close scrutiny. They were res extensa, whereas the subject, being utterly unextended in Descartes' new definition of mind or spirit, was close to view, essentially anonymous. Consciousness thus became irreversible. With the Renaissance, the subject having become wholly detached, disembodied, thus rendered anonymous, was not to be known, it was to do the knowing. But was the process of individuation really completed with the Renaissance? Was the subject now fully transcendent of space and the objects contained therein? Was space now completely continuous, a perfectly homogeneous context in which the Cartesian agent could operate with impunity to gain mastery over nature? To put the question a little differently, was apeiron entirely eliminated in the Renaissance experience of object in space before subject? We are going to see that in all cases the answer is no. The challenge to continuity. The space of the Renaissance is mapped by the system of coordinates Descartes invented for the purpose. At the center of an XY coordinate system is the 0,0 origin, origo. The origin of the reference frame plays a unique role, being the locus at which observation begins. 0,0 serves in effect as the surrogate for the subject's eyes. And remember, I and EYE, very important, as that from which a perspective upon the world opens out. Remember Petrarch standing on the cliff? To be sure, each time I change my point of view, my position in space changes and the 0,0 origin shifts accordingly. However, these transformations of the coordinate system are commensurable. They are encompassed in a single system of measurement, so that I can pass continuously from one frame of reference to the other. In this way, change in perspective is contained, subsumed within the changeless continuity that is space. Because one perspective can readily be transformed into the other by a continuous displacement in space. Perspectives can be said to be equivalent. The equivalence of perspectives in the new Cartesian space was dependent on the emergence of the new order of subjectivity. Fill me half a cup. The equivalence of perspectives in the new Cartesian space was dependent on the emergence of the new order of subjectivity. Descartes' cogito, or thinking subject, what Heidegger called the special subject. The cogito was a more abstract individual than was his pre-Renaissance predecessors. By detaching himself more completely from the earthly realm, he could transcend all particular standpoints and view reality from a universal frame of reference. It was from that point of view that particular perspectives were rendered equivalent. Concretely changing viewpoints are commensurable because they are undergirded by the changeless universal perspective of the cogito. Thus, whereas each 0,0 centered coordinate system is specifically situated in space, the generic I that lies behind these specific I's, EYEs, has no such fixed position in the extensive continuum. As noted above, Descartes' cogito is unextended, transcendent of space. Of course, the cogito is a theoretical entity in the practical operations of post-Renaissance science. The presence in space of a human observer was required to make measurements and conduct experiments. Nevertheless, it was possible to transcend theoretically the observer's local perspective, his or her whole local space and time, and to assume the universal outlook, that from which space and time are absolutely invariant. Thus, in this classical idealization, the standpoint of the actual observer was superseded by the panoptical, totally objective viewpoint of a godlike observer. So not only had man ascended to be God in creation, he was also God in observation, equally as important, or might even be more important. In the language of classical physics, the perspective, reference frame, coordinate system of the ideal observer is inertial, unmovable that is. An inertial frame of reference is one in which the laws of classical mechanics have full validity. In particular, inertial systems are subject to Isaac Newton's law of inertia, which states that a body at rest or in uniform motion will remain at rest or in uniform motion unless some outside force is applied to it. If we consider two such inertial systems, it is impossible to determine their respective states of motion independently of each other, since the motion one can only be established in relation to the other. Since the motion of one can only be established in relation to the other, remember Einsteinian revolution. We cannot say in absolute terms that a given system is at rest or that it is moving. For example, as I sit here at my computer, I seem to be at rest, but from the frame of reference of an astronaut, I am moving with the earth. I may want to know whether I'm moving or I am not. but there is no absolute answer. It all depends on the particular reference frame that is adopted. This is the principle of Galilean relativity. Nevertheless, on this classical view, there clearly is something that is not relative, something that does not change in going from one coordinate system to another. The laws of classical mechanics. Assuming that an astronaut and I are moving uniformly with respect to one another, the Newtonian laws governing the behavior of bodies in space and time are equally applicable, regardless of which frame of reference is chosen. We are therefore able to perform a Galilean transformation. My state of motion relative to my own reference frame, that wherein I seem to be at rest, may be converted into my state of motion relative to the astronaut's coordinate system, wherein I appear to be moving with the Earth. This inertial reference frame are entirely interchangeable. They are but particular variations on the universal viewpoint that is itself invariant. From this point of view, it is not so much concrete objects that are observed, rather what are observed are the changeless laws of classical mechanics. This is the idealized, purely objective reference frame of the generic Cartesian subject, that from which we can indeed speak of absolute rest, perfect inertia. Thus, whereas particular perspectives or coordinate systems are completely relative, the more abstract frame of reference of the cogito is not. In the foregoing classical account, we recognize the formula that derives from Plato, that is, object in space before subject. Plato's intention was that the only term of formula that would be susceptible to change would be the object. Both the subject, the demiurge, and the spatial continuum in which he operates were to be wholly invariant. But Plato did have his problems with the apeiron, as we've seen. Apparently it was Descartes and Newton who finally succeeded in banishing apeiron and thereby fully stabilizing the subject and its sphere of action once and for all. Or did they? Doubts about continuity in the age of light. The complete banishment of apeiron requires complete agreement between theoretical and empirical reality. For the chaotic divergences of the material realm to be reined in, for unitary order to be fully imposed, local observations must be made fully consistent with the cogito's global perspective. Was this actually achieved in the physics of Galileo, Descartes and Newton? In a paper titled Global Idealism, Local Materialism, Koichiro Masuno and S.N. Salte point out that the theoretical assumptions made by classical mechanics of a Laplacian demon, a global observer with an instantaneous bird-eye view of everything, and was not much more than an article of metaphysical faith, one that had not been definitely reconciled with the worm's eye view of the empirical observer gathering actual data down on the ground. Or as Gary Zukov put it in his popular treatment of the history of physics, no one had actually found a coordinate system in which the laws of mechanics were valid. Therefore, while physics had assumed the existence of an ideal inertial system, one that was perfectly at rest, the truth was that no such system had been unequivocally demonstrated. Measurements always revealed small discrepancies between theoretical expectations and values that were actually obtained. Though future refinements in measuring devices might eventually bring theory and data into perfect alignment, in the absence of definite proof there remained the possibility that concrete differences in perspective might turn out not to be wholly equivalent when regarded from the abstract point of view, that Galilean transformations from one coordinate system to another might not be perfectly continuous, that the extensive continuum itself might be something of a fiction. What all this intimated was the possibility that apeiron was still at play. Nevertheless, there was no disputing success of post-Renaissance physics in transforming human culture. As a result of the early efforts of Galileo, Descartes and Newton, science and technology came into their own, and this in turn led to the creation of a whole new world. It stood to reason that while the perfection of generic Cartesian subject might have been fictitious, this abstract individual was real enough, at least in terms of its practical impact. However, in the age of classical mechanics, 16th to 19th centuries, the idealization of the cogito was clearly tolerable, since it was possible effectively to ignore limitations on the precision with which the motions of bodies could be measured. Approximation could be taken for reality with no major consequences to the scientific enterprise. Then, in the 19th century, came the Age of Light. In the preface to this book, I cited Jasper's comment on how science changed in the century that followed the death of Kant. It extends further than in Kant's time. It is more radical than ever, both in the precision of its method and in its consequences. But Jaspers goes on to tell us that in the very extension and refinement of science, the limitations of scientific knowing have become much more transparent. Quote, "We experience the limits of science as limits of our ability to know, and as limits of our realization of the world through knowledge. The knowledge of science fails in the face of the all ultimate questions." End of quote. For my part, I would emphasize that the barrier science reached as it progressed into the 19th century was not merely an external one. It was not simply that the scientific approach was found to be inapplicable to traditionally non-scientific fields of knowledge. It was the fundamental problems arose within science itself. As physics pressed towards even higher levels of exactitude, extending itself to the extremes of measurement, to the limits of its scales, ultra-high velocities, submicroscopic distances, etc., some of its most basic expectations were upset. The initial upheaval came with the failure of Galilean relativity implicit in the experiment of light done by Albert Michelson and Edward Moley in 1887. In the course of the 19th century, concerns with the influences of relatively crude mechanical forces upon ponderable bodies gave way to an in-depth investigation of the more subtle phenomena of electricity and magnetism. By the 1870s, in the research of Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell had culminated in the theory that all forms of electromagnetic energy, light included, are propagated as waves. It seemed obvious that even though an electromagnetic wave was more elusive phenomena than were mechanical waves, such as those found in water or air, it nevertheless required a medium through which it was transmitted. Without such a medium, it would be difficult to see how the energy could be propagated in a continuous, objectively observable fashion. Just as a water wave travels through water and a sound wave travels continuously through air, a light wave must have its own more subtle medium through which to travel. The implication of this attitude was that electromagnetism was still essentially to be viewed in mechanical terms, as a classical phenomenon, as an object in space. The medium posited for transmission of electromagnetic waves was the luminiferous ether. The ether was said to pervade the entire universe and was alleged to be a paragon of purity. Before 1887, there wasn't a single human being on this earth who didn't fully know that ether existed. There were no exception to that. No one would have been able, and this is important, no one would have been able to question it. And if you're not even able, disbelief doesn't work. The ether was said to pervade the entire universe and was alleged to be a paragon of purity. So fine-grained and subtle was the ether sea that it was utterly impossible to detect. Ether thalassa, I would say. Thalassa. Possessing few properties and no action of its own, it served exclusively as the framework within which the motions of coarser substances could be measured and analyzed mechanically, including the motion of light. Being completely immobile, absolutely at rest, the ether would be decisive inertial system. It would provide spatio-temporal continuity par excellence. It would be the coordinate system that would anchor the transformation of all other coordinate systems, rendering them all completely equivalent in the universal view of the transcendent cogito. This had been the underlying hope and expectation of classical physics all along, and it would now be confirmed. Plato's leaky old vessel would be sealed hermetically once and for all. Apeiron would at last be banished in a definite way. I suggest that at bottom it was not just the success of physics that was at stake in verifying the existence of the ether. Well below the threshold of what 19th century physicists were prepared to acknowledge, something more basic was at risk. The stable sense of individual identity that had been cultivated from at least as far back as the mythic epoch was now open to question, as we will shortly see. An important milestone of mid-19th century science that made it possible to test the theory of ether was the development of the ability to directly measure the velocity of light, achieved by Armand Fizeau in 1849. It was this that Michelson and Morley depended upon in devising the interferometer for that crucial experiment. If it was true that light moved through motionless ethereal continuum, then the key principle of Galilean transformation should apply. The addition of velocities, assuming light to propagate through the ether at the absolute speed of c. A traveler moving toward a beam of light should observe the beam to be approaching her at a velocity greater than c, her own velocity being added to c to obtain the higher relative velocity. Similarly, if the light beam and the observer were moving away from each other through the ether, the relative velocity of the light beam would be less than c, the observer's velocity now being subtracted from c. What Michelson and Morley discovered was that the velocity of light actually always appeared to be the same. regardless of its direction of motion relative to the observer. This astonishing result sounded the death knell of the ether theory. This is the same as a train approaching you will have the same relative velocity as a train leaving you. And assuming that you're running towards the train or traveling in a car towards the train, that obviously holds for Earth. And it was only lacking a small decimal, maybe the 10th decimal or the 20th, but it was accurate. So still to this point, to 1897, it was accurate. So the Platonic, the Galilean, the Newtonian ideal still held. It was approximate, it did still work, it was just a pure decimal, but then in 1887 it was shown to be no longer correct. And you can imagine here it went from one thing to another very hastily. It went so hastily that Michelson and Morley's discovery went unregarded for a long time outside the scientific society. The failure of Galilean relativity was indeed baffling to the classical eye. It is not an obvious fact of perception that if I change my perspective on an object I'm viewing, its appearance will change accordingly. What the Michelson-Morley experiment demonstrated in its abstract way was that when the object being considered is light, the familiar principle of experience does not apply. So if the object is light, it does no longer apply. So my question, is the object light? It is, I'm afraid. The reason being, remember the EYE, the eye. It's also homonymous with I, me. And all objects in the entire universe, they come to my eye through light. They all enter my eye through light. And now in this, it was proven beyond dispute that light itself did not follow the laws of Plato, Galileo, Newton, or any other philosopher, thinker, observer until that very moment. It was the death of the inertial frame of reference. The coordinate system was proven to be not working. It worked until then. Until a certain moment in history it worked, and after that it was never to be working again. It was that extreme, and this is why it's called the era of light. I'll try to wrap up here. Objects are light. All familiar principles of experience will no longer apply. It would certainly look strange to me if I got up from this computer screen I'm sitting at, moved all the way to the right of it so that I was viewing the screen at an acute angle from the side, but found that the screen had the same full square appearance as when I was sitting directly in front of it. And analogously, this is what Michelson and Morley saw. when they looked at light from different angles. And these are reference frames. This strange outcome was most alarming to physicists. It came as a bombshell that was soon to precipitate a revolution in physics. That is because the findings of Michelson and Morley did nothing less than call into question the classical intuition of object in space before subject that had implicitly governed human experience for eternity. We know that maintenance of classical identity is essentially predicated on separating subject and object in such a way that, whereas objects change concretely, the subject and the space in which it operates remains abstractly the same. The concrete change I expect to see when I shift my position with respect to the computer screen presupposes that the spatial context within which I make this observation itself does not change, that its continuity is preserved. By the same token, the presupposition is that I do not change, that the invisible I behind these eyes remain indivisible, retains its individuality. It is because a solitary individual lies behind the multiplicity of concretely shifting perspectives that said perspectives are readily interchangeable, with one being continuously transformable into another in a predictable fashion. Confirmation of these predictions serves to confirm the cogito sense of himself. When, upon altering my perspectives, I see how the appearance of an object I have been viewing changes as expected, I am indeed reassured that I have not changed. What Michelson and Morley saw was not reassuring. To appreciate just how deeply troubling the Michelson-Morley experiment was, let us digress briefly to return to the root of the problem. Culture theorist Elisabeth Gross examines the original condition for the emergence of individuality. For the subject to take up a position as a subject, it must be able to be situated in the space occupied by its body. This anchoring of subjectivity in its body is a condition for coherent identity, and moreover, the condition under which the subject has a perspective on the world and becomes a source for vision, a point from which vision emanates and to which light is focused. And I quote, "The emergent subject is the focal point organizing space, the representation of space, a correlate of one's ability to locate oneself as the point of reference of space. The space represented is a complement of the kind of subject who occupies it. Fully developed, the space in question is the perspective space that has dominated perception at least since Renaissance. In its continuum, in sum, a stabilized body image, a consistent and abiding sense of self and bodily boundaries, requires and entails understandings one's position vis-a-vis others, one's place at the apex or organizing point in the perception of space. So our earliest, most basic sense of ourselves as stable, autonomous individuals is inseparably linked to our experience with space. How very interesting. I think we end with that revolution. And Kalle, please, yes.
Let me take the microphone. So there has been much focus on the light and also indirectly on the eyes. So would you say that eyes are the most important sense that we have, given its link to the light, or?
It is very, very important in connection with I and I. And I don't think it's, especially after the lecture we had yesterday with words, I realize now the connection is obvious. And Rosen plays on this. I thought it was a play, but it is not. I and I are not only homonyms, they are also the same thing. We are essentially I. The vision is what we are.
Yes, I would like to give a reflection that fits well with this, namely from Heraclitus. And he speaks relatively much about the senses, and he says that the eye is a better reliable thing than the hearing. And you see, it fits well with this. He also says that the sun is the most important thing that we have, or the fire and the sun. So I think it complements each other. That I think that Heraclitus had a sense for what was important. That is the eye, and the fire. That is the sun.
I can add two more things to that. 1.5 years ago, I read a philosopher, and he was based everything on light. I forgot his name, but your friend, I'm speaking to Kalle now for the audience here, your friend in, I mentioned that after the video, I think. But it's very interesting, we had a synchronicity here. Someone know that philosopher, and Kalle had some contact with that person. And I read him, and to be honest, because of this Michelson-Morley experiment, I know about it, but until now it wasn't clear to me. Now I realize the potential for that philosopher. I will study him again, give him a new chance, but he says that everything starts with light, and there is no chance that Heraclitus mentions the sun and light and fire.
And the eye.
And the eye, yeah. Eye and light is actually the same thing, oddly enough. It's exactly the same thing. There is no difference. And so is I, to be an I.
Well, can you show the spelling of that experiment that was where the light is? Can you show the spelling? Is it?
Mike, I will put it in the description.
Let me show it quickly.
Kalle, I will put it in the description, so you don't.
Michelson-Morley, okay.
Michelson-Morley.
MM, to remember.
Yes, it opened up my eye here. It was a bit of an eye opener, and of course, this was also a disaster for the old view of thinking of those things. But most people couldn't hack it. They could not survive it. It led to the fin de siècle disaster in philosophy and among scientists. But I think the problem is, and this is my take on this is my guess. I don't know what Rosen is going to conclude here, and I will not second guess him. But I think Yes, could be disaster, but I'm pretty sure it could be an eye-opener.
The eye opener.
I think literally the meaning of eye and eye is the same. And as long as we think there are two different things in language, that the semantical meaning is different, then we make the mistake.
In this connection you have another homonym which is really suitable, namely light and light, namely light, force, and light to be light.
Yeah,
And,
definitely.
and that was important for Heidegger for the reasons he's working with German, of course. But we are speaking much about this, the light of Plato. It is gave. Okay, Plato.
You need to hold it a bit faster,
yes.
not move it.
Yes. So Plato was not completely off. Okay, light is important. Absolutely, we know that. But that we have to connect the light to the senses.
Oh yeah.
That Plato went wrong there. And so Lichtung for Heidegger, that was Lichtung. You can understand it in two ways. Lichtung like light, but also Lichtung to make light. That is light in the sense not be heavy.
And Lichtung is also can have a verbal tendencies to make a light, because if you cut down the trees, that's a process, and thereby you get a light. And especially in the dense forest, it's so obvious already when you cut the first 3-4 trees. It's a different universe. And I remember when I saw it, I was like 8 or 9 years old. I was feeling that a new world was emerging. And later, I think, after leaving Lichtung or opening, I was tricked into the idea that everything should be Lichtung. But I realize now Lichtung disappears if there is no woods. If there is no darkness, we don't have Lichtung either. And I think I lost Lichtung in the end. And Rosen shows the way back, I would say. It's an eye-opener. But this is me second-guessing him. I just read part of a chapter.
Bravo, Hans,
I
for
say
taking up
thank
this
you very much.
text. Thank you.
Have a very
Bravo,
pleasant
Hans.